Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of What Makes You Click. I'm really pleased that today I've got with me somebody I've known for probably more years than I can remember, David Appleby. I've always admired David and his work ethic. He's been working in clinical behaviour for well over 30 years now. Has vast experience of doing the job, and that was one of the things I think which really, to me, really impressed me about David was he seemed to be everywhere, so doing consultations. So it's not surprising that I think your first paper actually was a review of some of your caseload, and nobody else I think would have had that sort of caseload to talk about. And the other thing about David, which sort of over the years I've got to know David because he's been involved in a lot of committees and organisations that have helped to raise the standard of the profession. Now, as an academic, I get paid the same salary regardless of what I'm doing. David, as a private practitioner, doesn't. So he's given up a vast amount of time and salary in order to try and raise standards, and I think that's very admirable. He's always the person who always had the new tech as well. I remember he used to have that really small little keypad when we had some of those
Oh, Palm
ASAP.
Pilot thing.
um,
Yeah, Scion, but yeah, I know.
yeah, so hopefully, if we've got any tech problems, David will be able to sort it out for me. He set up the first behaviour clinic at Cambridge Vet School, and I think you've done the same now in Finland, in the Helsinki Vet School. And so, you know, a true pioneer in the true sense. And thank you for agreeing to have a chat with me tonight. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And so, I mean, one of the things I've never asked you, but I've sort of wondered about, because correct me if I'm wrong, and I may well be wrong at this quite often in these situations. You started off in the Air Force as a dog handler, and
Yep,
then into then into guide dogs, wasn't it?
that's right. Yeah,
And then you moved into the behaviour field. So,
yeah.
you know, given, I mean, I've got an idea of approximately how old you are. The training, the sort of the experience of being in the Air Force and training dogs at that time, and equally maybe with guide dogs as well. You know, it must be very different to what goes on now or whatever. And a bit of a baptism of fire, was it? Or I mean, what was it? What
The
was it
early
like?
days, the early days with the RAF, fairly standard police dog type training. Tom Scott style, not as bad as Conrad Most.
Mm.
Um, the by a long way. But I was very lucky. One of the civilian advisor to the RAF, the second one during my time there, was Terry McCarthy, and he was an international judge, and he was very forward thinking for the time, and he had a habit of asking probing questions, which made you think, and it certainly stimulated me to think a lot more about dogs than just the at the time basic police dog training in the Tom Scott style. Not that we're following it, but anyone that's read one of his books will know the style I mean. And by the time I was leaving the RAF, I was already reading Fox, for example. I remember falling asleep on a flight back from Northern Ireland, reading the dog, its domestication and behavior. But I was already into a deeper understanding of what constitutes dogs and canine behavior. And that then followed through as I went through into guide dogs. Guide dogs for the blind was a fairly natural development. I left the RAF, I brought myself out of the RAF because I was going to be promoted, and the chances of my staying with dogs was decreasing because the higher up the scale you go, the less opportunities there are to work with dogs. So I brought myself out, having secured a job with an apprenticeship with Guide Dogs for the Blind. And in fact, once the Air Force knew that I was buying myself out, actually dropped the price when they knew where I was going, they dropped the price I had to pay myself out with.
Wow.
Considerably. Guide Dogs for the Blind taught me a lot that I think is relevant to what we do in clinical animal behavior, in as much as the dogs are learning or are responding to environmental cues. They have to. Of course, they get cues from their handlers, but when it comes to actually guiding, they're interpreting the environment, they're responding to what they've learned about the cues within the environment. And that's something we can apply so much in clinical animal behavior in cases, rather than the owner being entirely responsible for giving instructions to the dog to modify its behavior, getting the dog to read the cues in the environment that will lead it to getting the reinforcements that it's looking for.
Yeah, I mean, it's what we say, for problem behaviour, you're trying to create the well-behaved dog. You don't want to be instructing it the whole time. You want it to be picking up. I never actually made that connection, actually, that, yeah, that's exactly what guide dogs are doing the whole time. You have to do that. So did you have like a 20-year commission with the RAF you had to buy out, or?
No, I was there for 7 years, but I can't remember how many years I actually signed up for.
But
pass. Don't know. But I left after 7, so maybe it was something like 10, something like that.
Oh well, but well, you did well out of it after all. But that's quite something to take that leap. So I mean, so what you said? You said, the higher you go up, the less the chances of you remaining with the dogs and the promotion. So, I mean, did you start actively, had you already got the idea that you wanted to work with guide dogs, or was it just sort of...
When I left the Air Force, I'd already applied to work with guide dogs. I had, I can't remember the actual sequence of events, which is going to be a problem all night, I think. Actually,
don't worry.
Details, but I'd applied to come out. I think I had an interview already with Guide Dogs for the Blind, and then I got a formal acceptance once I brought myself out, or whatever.
So you mentioned Fox's book, or some of his work. I mean, just out of interest, what were your other big influences at that time, both people and books? Were there?
Oh dear. There wasn't so much available.
No.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
I didn't get into Scotland Fuller until later.
What was Pfaffenberger? Was that? Pfaffenberger was that?
Pfaffenberger, yeah. Pfaffenberger, and his book about guide dogs, which Derek Freeman, who was the breeding manager for Guide Dogs for the Blind, he based a lot of his early principles on that, and Fox's writing, and Friedman, King and Elliot, and things like that.
Okay, so Freeman was around in your day, or
we're talking about Derek Freeman.
Yeah.
The Guide Dogs for the Blind breeding manager. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So at some point you're working with guide dogs and you end up in problem behaviour. How did that come about?
Osmosis. I had in my head that my entire career was going to be now about being a guide dog mobility instructor. I thought that's the way I was going, and I thought this was it. This was where I wanted to be. And then I heard Roger give a talk.
Roger Mugford.
Roger Mugford, yeah. And that created some interest. And then the tipping point was a friend of a friend whose dog had chased a child down the road and nipped it. So my friend asked me if I would go and talk to them and help. And I did, and the results were good. And then that led to another one, and then another one. I was, at the time, was the head instructor of Leamington Spa's dog training school, or not training school, dog training club, which was actually running 6 days a week with autonomous sections for working trials and agility and obedience, he said, inverted commas, and ordinary pet behavior and show dogs, and there was a gun dog section as well, so it was quite diverse. So there was a ready pool of people asking for help to start with, and then I thought I could do this as a part-time occupation. So I was working for Guide Dogs for the Blind, then working for myself, seeing cases, and sleeping.
Oh, you did do some of that.
Yeah. My life, that's how my life went for about a year. And then I decided I would try and do this full time, because if you don't try and experiment, you're never going to know if it was going to work out or not. You never know what you're going to regret through not having done it. So the Director General for Guide Dogs for the Blind happened to come to our centre and said, go and do it. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, come back. You'll be richer for the experience. Now, it might have just been a good way of getting me out the door, but I think, well, I never looked back. It just went hand over fist.
So I will dare to ask, what year were you in Leamington Spa? Because I was in practice at Lane and Murray, who did the veterinary work for Guide Dogs before I moved into academia. Yeah. So that was 93 that I was there.
I was long gone by then. Yeah. I left Guide Dogs in 80. I started part-time in 86 and I left Guide Dogs in 87.
Okay. So yeah. But it's fun. It's a small world, isn't it?
Dick Lane was the retained vet for Leamington Spa.
That's the reason why I moved to the practice. So I started off my veterinary career working for the PDSA in the southwest, and then this job came up at Lane and Murray, because they did the veterinary work for Guide Dogs, and I just thought, oh, that looks interesting. And then around about that time, Dogs for the Disabled was being set up, and they were very much underwritten, I think, pretty much by Guide Dogs for the Blind. And then this bizarre job came up in academia, and like you, never looked back. Always said, sort of a bit like you, I thought, well, I'll go back into practice if I stop enjoying what I'm doing, and I don't think I could go back into practice now. Things have moved on.
The nature of the beast for being a guide dog mobility instructor changed a lot, apparently, after I left. So I don't think I would have wanted to go back in the end.
So a guide dog mobility instructor, they're the people that do much more the pairing of the dog with the person, aren't they?
Yeah.
So you're doing...
Yes, it's not just the pairing. At the time that I was an instructor, so things may be different. You had to go through an apprenticeship, so you had to go and work in kennels for a period of time, and you're constantly being assessed. Then a period as a guide dog trainer, which is the basic training. I say basic, so it's the foundation work. They do the foundation work. So continuing on from their puppy rearing experience by the volunteer puppy walkers who've been socializing them and habituating them to the environment. They then start the straight line work. So the dogs at the time, this was, again, I just need to stress for anyone who worked with guide dogs, this was how it was at the time. Developing the straight line work, so the dogs would think of going from curb to curb and in a straight line until they got to a curb where they were given the instructions to go in a new direction. Stopping at curbs, basic obstacle avoidance as things developed. So it was all in stages. So it was within the dog's capacity to cope, and success was built on success. And then they would then be handed over to guide dog mobility instructors. Of course, social behavior was also brought in, so it was a good excuse to go into a cafe. And the guide dog mobility instructors would have 4-5 dogs with a view to dropping one back to the next upcoming group of instructors. And then at the end of the advanced training, which was advanced obstacle avoidance, going into different environments much more, crowd work much more, and did I say traffic avoidance? Then they would match the dog to the person who was on file, or someone on file that they thought was going to be the best possible match, and then train them over a residential course for 4 weeks if it was their first dog, going from basics all the way through to qualifying, and then doing aftercare, touring the geographical area, not only seeing the clients that they've just seen on class and settling them in, but doing aftercare once a year on all guide dog units.
So one of the things I remember when I was in practice, because you had the puppy socializers, and it seemed that guide dogs were petrified of them teaching dogs bad habits. So I think they were given instructions they mustn't teach the dogs anything. Well, the dogs were still learning, so we'd get them into the clinic and they were just completely out of control because they're basically being told that sort of, don't try and teach the dog anything because our instructors are going to do that later on. And he just thought, this is madness, And I think they've moved on since then, but it was.
They were under supervision by puppy walking supervisors who would visit at least once a month, I think it was, as they were developing. And I think I can't entirely recount the details of this because the guide dog breeding center and puppy walking supervisors were at Tollgate House,
right,
which was separate from Leamington Spa, and Leamington Spa just happened to be geographically close because there are other guide dog mobility schools, as you know, I guess, Forfar and Wokingham and Exeter and so on and so forth. I think what you're alluding to is the concern that the dog's initiative might be reduced if it has too much control by the puppy walkers.
Okay, so and it's I mean,
you need to be confident and outgoing to an extent. My impression was that we're required to have at least good social behaviour. So jumping up in the veterinary clinic, I would be slightly surprised at.
Oh, I can tell you there were quite a few that did that, but I think that's quite an interesting, because as I said, I just took it from the other end, and certainly some of the clients that I spoke to that were doing that, and they were sort of, but yeah, there is that knock-on effect that giving them the freedom to express them, and because they will have to be creative with some of the problems they're going to encounter later on.
You're going to have to be confident.
And
not too inhibited.
So you can't, it's not just a question of, shaping every task and thinking that the dog's now, programmed and therefore it can do it. You've got to build and I remember chatting to Bruce Johnston, who joined Guide Dogs, was probably late 80s, early 90s, who was blind himself, and he was sort of trying to this idea of getting the dog as a thinking animal as opposed to a tool or asset in that way, and making them better problem solvers so that they could I think at that time there was a lot of lowering of curbs, which was posing a challenge, that there were these areas where sometimes you had cars going through and sometimes you didn't, and so you needed the dog to take more responsibility. And whilst these things seem superficially straightforward, you then realise that, no, this is actually quite a difficult task for the dog.
He sort of started with guide dogs around about the same time as I was finishing. I don't remember being employed by them per se at that time, but he was certainly coming, and he was having some influence. And he brought in a concept of training the dog holistically, so not starting in quiet areas with obvious curves, with obvious straight lines, and gradually developing their capacity to cope with increasingly stressful environments, but to start the training pretty much straight away in any environment, and gradually build up in those environments. I may be paraphrasing too much, and my memory may be failing me. But as an example, when he did a talk, a video of him working with his dog was shown. And one of the signs of stress for me in guide dogs for the blind is going out through the left shoulder.
Okay.
And I was being into horses, and I was the chief instructor for the saddle club in RAF Akrotiri when I was there.
Oh, wow.
That we had, I think it was something like 15, 16 horses and 90 riding members. And the last year I was there, we beat the army at 3-day eventing, which was very, very nice. Everything except for tent pegging, because we were using sharpened javelins and they were using spears. But but for the 3-day eventing, it was great. Anyway, where were we? Bruce Johnson. So I was very much into how a horse should be balanced and how it should in dressage, Alice Badaski, etc., with the Spanish riding school, how they should, their spine should follow the curve they're going through, etc. And I applied this and did a little paper for guide dogs on it, but it didn't go anywhere, on how a guide dog becomes to an obstacle, and you take the owner round it, it should turn away, and its spine should be bent, and it should be balanced, and then when it comes back round the other way, you can't see my hands, but the spine should follow the curvature of the spine should follow the direction. And anyway, on this video, his dog was crabbing out of the left shoulder, and it made me question whether or not this sort of let's do the training all at once and the dog's intelligent, etc., was actually too stressful for them. But I never got the chance to see that thought through.
Yeah. No, I mean, I always had enormous respect for Bruce, and I've forgotten how I got to meet him initially, but because he was blind himself, and he said the first dog that they trained in that way was his own dog. And I'm thinking, well, if anybody's got anything to lose, in the testing of their ideas, it's him, because he's going to end up being walked out into traffic and knocked over. But I do love his little book. If people aren't aware, is it called Thinking Guide Dog? I can't remember. I'll find it and try and remember. I'll just make a note to put it up on the with the podcast so people can check out, because I still think some of the ideas there are really good. About teaching the dog to be more thinking, and so he moved to guide dogs, and it was Mike Cernovitz who was the sort of the chief executive, and then I think within about 6 months of him taking up the position, Mike dropped down dead from a heart attack.
He got me my first on my own private border collie, Mike Cernovitz.
Oh, right.
He was heavily into sheepdogs.
So I never knew that you did anything with horses. Kept that one quiet.
There are 3 horses outside here now.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen them on your Facebook page, that you mention of the horses. But I never knew you did. Do you ride still?
No. And these horses have not been backed, if that's the right or wrong term. They're still quite young, 2 years. So,
I mean, this is going through the history. So you then started doing the stuff privately, and then, you're involved in the setup of the APBC, which was the first real, to me, it came across as the first sort of group of individuals that were trying to raise the bar with, with the quality of what was going on. I mean, how did that come about? Just for reference, it was Valerie O'Farrell at Edinburgh.
Not initially.
Okay, so Peter Neville, John Fisher,
Peter,
just the three of you then, or?
No, John Rogerson.
Oh, no, John Rogerson, of course, yeah, sorry.
And very soon after that, it was Valerie O'Farrell.
Okay, and then Sarah Heath was the first vet to join them as well.
Yeah.
So how did that come about?
The Sarah or
no, the APBC. As a
okay. So, is anyone still awake? I wonder. If we're doing...
Well, as I said, I'm interested in this. Because, as I said, it's I'm just. We'll get to CCAB in a minute. That can really send people to sleep.
Peter had been working with Roger, and he left working with Roger, and then he contacted me to see if he could come and talk to me. And he had already been talking to John Fisher about setting up what became the APBC. And we had a meeting at my place, and I agreed to be on board. And then John Rogerson, he went to see. And it was not long after that Valerie Farrell had joined us. It was about standards was the main issue. It was the background of, for example, there was a Daily Mail article of a man calling himself a pet behavior counselor or dog behavior counselor. I can't remember what he actually called himself, but he would give you a consultation and sell you the walking stick to use on your dog. So it was that sort of environment. There was the environment of Barbara Woodhouse.
Okay.
We wanted to set a standard that people would have some confidence in, and ultimately vets would have confidence in referring to. Because very quickly we became a referral organisation. The referral was required, and we wanted to work within a veterinary context.
I think that's one of the things that really made the organisation stand out as well. And I think it's easy to underestimate how influential that was actually also on the veterinary profession as well, realising that they need to know something about it. And we're still trying to get there with the veterinary profession. That's their way.
Yeah. And getting veterinary referrals was very, very difficult in the beginning. So we got ourselves set up, and then very quickly, again, I can't remember the actual timeline or how much I confused, but I will try and tell it as best I remember it. So we had this situation where we said we were going to be working on veterinary referral, but getting veterinary referrals was difficult. And indeed, there were letters in the Veterinary Times sort of saying, what is this new science of behavior counseling? It's, just have ordinary dog trainers, etc. So that wasn't helpful. And I used to, in those early days, I used to write reports to the veterinary surgeon, where the report, which would now be the client report, quite rightly, was written to the veterinary surgeon, and the client had a copy of that, but all the detail was in there, and exactly everything that should be done. And the client would have a whole lot of other support material as well. And the main premise for that was A, to say, look, we're here, and B, this is what it's about. And this is why this dog has a problem, and this is the treatment approach, to try and put that information out there so that it became part and parcel of veterinary practice.
So were there individuals in the problem behaviour field? 'Cause for me, as I said, like you, sort of, it started off with a lecture from Roger Mugford when I was at Bristol, and I saw practice with him, and that would be this sort of mid late 80s, and he said, if you're interested in this, you've got to go to the States, and that's where I met a lot of the people I've been chatting to on these podcasts, and I've remained friends with them. Were there other people that were big influences on you at that time with the problem behaviour, or were you just sort of feeling your way as a community as you went forward? I don't know.
Well, there was certainly a lot of that. We were having to make it up as we went along to some extent, but of course, I didn't have the privilege of going to the States, but I read a lot of Voice in the early days. And we tended to go and see practice with each other. I visited John Fisher to see how he was approaching things. Attended some of names escape me for a moment. John Rogerson's courses, and I think they were the main inspirations. Everything that was possible to read as it became published, then I would read it. With no internet, so you had to have the hard copy, of course.
Yeah, and there wasn't as much coming out in those days, which has always made it easier. But in fact, you mentioned Vicky Voith, and I did one of these podcasts with Vicky Voith, and she was one of the drivers as to why I started these podcasts, because I was lecturing to the students about protocols and talking about Vicky Voith, because she was at Philadelphia when they were starting to codify it for people, some of these treatments, and because she was in the vet school, she said, well, we can do this with the animals as well. And the students just looked at me blank, as if, who is this person? Why are you even bothering to tell us your name? Because, although she published the seminal stuff, it's become so mainstream, nobody bothers to cite her associated with it. And I just thought, that isn't right. People need to know about these people, and and she's still, busy in practice as well as in academia.
Perennial problem of marking student papers when they don't go back to the original sources but cite secondary sources incorrectly. Yes.
Yeah, and I've done that in a few years with some of my undergraduate students. What I call is daisy chaining. And we take a concept and we look at some papers published in recent years, and then look at how the person is using the concept when they define it, and the references, and look to try and work out sort of, it's like Chinese whispers. This is what the original paper said. This is what they're saying now. Can you see the evolution of how it's changed because people have misquoted and misrepresented it? And it's terrible. I mean, and dominance was the big one. Is a big one like that. And it's quite interesting to look at how it gets distorted and misunderstood in relation to all of that. As you say, so that sort of, I guess, brings me to another point which I find intriguing. As I don't want to sound offensive, but you went and did the masters. You were really well. You were known well. You lectured at academic institutions, but you still decided to go off and do a masters. Having established yourself in the career. Now, again, that's quite. I have enormous admiration because that's quite a thing to do. And I just wondered what made you think that, attracted you to doing the masters at Southampton.
It was a no-brainer. I didn't stop to think about it. The APBC had been not instrumental, but they had been consulted by John Bradshaw and Anne McBride with regard to the setting up of a course. I don't remember the details, but I think it was things like what would be appropriate to be within the course, and is it needed, etc., etc. We had a meeting at Gwen Bailey's house for that, I believe. And once the course became available, I signed up.
I thought you'd be teaching on it. That's the thing. I just thought, you'd just be teaching on it rather than.
I wanted the knowledge.
Yeah.
And I wanted the science, and I saw a future where the profession should be a profession. Should be that people seeking help should go and see someone who has had specific training in the subject. Whereas the APBC started with no specific criteria for membership, then it became normally a degree. And that became a political hot potato because Barry O'Farrell, the Royal Dick, dropped out of the APBC because it was normally a degree rather than always a degree. And John Rogerson left the APBC. One of the main reasons, I think, as far as I remember, was because a degree was normally required, and he didn't think that should be necessary. So we carried on this course, however, steaming a straight line of a degree in a relevant subject will normally be required. And then we now have this specific course in companion animal behavior counseling. And I saw a future where that was going to be the preferred route for people doing this job, for it to become a proper profession. And so I had to put my money where my mouth was.
Wow.
And
yeah.
I did it.
No, and hats off to you. So that's interesting because, in a way it's quite sad because we're sort of still repeating in that cycle. So, we're both involved in the setting up of the CCAB scheme, the Certificated Clinical Animal Behaviourist in the UK, which was trying to mirror the system that was in the States. And there was the discussions we had about the importance of a degree, and that was accepted, and that was supported. The ASAB scheme, Association for the Study of Animal Behaviour, although it's run by ASAB, it had the support of the British Psychological Society, it had the support of ISAE, and that's the reason why I was on the committee, and I still am.
Royal College.
And the Royal College, but ASAB were to run it. And, so they set the standard as normally a degree 2-1 or equivalent experience. And just in recent years, there's been kickback against that. But, no, that's setting the standard too high. And I'm thinking, I don't think... God, when did we start doing that? Probably 15, 20 years ago with the ASAB scheme. And, and I don't think educational standards have got that much higher, And if you were talking about it in 1990 about the importance of having a degree level, I think it's sad that people are saying, you don't have to. And it isn't, because, you can look at it from both sides, you are, you're a very able, capable practitioner, but you still recognise the importance of that academic side. And I just wonder if anybody listening into this, if there is anyone still listening at the moment, but and it's still something that people come up. You're probably in a better position than somebody like me who, as an academic, to say the importance of that academic training, what you get from a degree that you don't get from just the practice. Do you want to say anything about that or not? Am I just about it?
I think what you're describing, this ongoing problem, is that there is an ethos that wants to protect, if that's the right word, that wants to protect the rights of the individual who wants to do companion animal behavior as their profession. And then there is the thought that, or the school of thought, that anyone wanting to do companion animal behavior should be qualified to do so. They should have jumped a bar and got over that bar. And once they have that standard, then they're safe for the people that are seeking help from them. And the ABBC signed up to totally support the ASAB scheme, and then it reneged on that. And now there's an alternative organization that
Fellowship of Animal Behaviour Clinicians, Fab Clinicians. It's an easier one to,
who are going along the ethos that people should achieve the qualification. That's not exclusive to anybody.
No.
Everybody has the opportunity to get that qualification, to get there, to get over that bar. But have it from with an academic understanding, because they've done an academic course, so that they know what they don't know.
That, I think you're just absolutely spot on. Or you become aware that there's a lot you don't know, even if it's the known unknowns and also the unknown unknowns. But and
but the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, people who don't know what the Dunning-Kruger effect is. People with least knowledge rate themselves most highly in their competence, and as you say, I think it's a great shame that the APPC stepped back from that, and I have no idea what the reason was behind it. I've heard it said that, we need to have more clinicians out there. We're just not producing enough. But it's a difficult one because it's hard to raise the standard if you've got afterwards. And as you said, back in the 90s, we were saying that you should have a degree in a relevant subject, and you said it's not about the subject matter, it's that broader education of understanding both the approach, I think the scientific approach, but also that awareness that you're never going to know it all, and just be a little bit more cautious and understanding those skills.
In the early days of the developments of the CCAB scheme, one of the analogies that was made was the development of the veterinary profession from barriers.
Yeah.
There was a time when experience was the way to learn how to deal with these problems, but there came a point where that changed to a veterinary degree.
So my dad was... So when I went into practice in Plymouth, there was a guy called Fernley Slee, and he was one of the old practitioners who didn't go to vet school but got incorporated under the Act because of his experience. And my father, he went to London and he graduated with the MRCVS, and he was never given the veterinary degree, the BVet Med that they give. You did at the end of the London course, you did the exams to become a member of the Royal College, and you didn't get a degree. And there was, for quite a while, a campaign to say, well, look, all of these people, they're all retired now anyway, but shouldn't they be given honorary degrees? Because, in effect, that's what they did. And for whatever reason, they didn't. And I think it's a great shame. But, they had the formal training. And my father was, as I said, in that sort of transition period. But Fernley was just... every practitioner, he used to have these parties in his house, and everybody got to know Fernley, and his wealth of experience was just there were always nuggets there. But as you say, it's so.
And the transition period that was provided for a long time was that the grandfathering scheme and mapping. Yeah. There was plenty of opportunity for those that were in the profession to fill in gaps when necessary and map their experience so that they could get accreditation.
Yeah. So, anybody listening out there, my advice, and I don't know whether you agree with it or not, if you're looking for a good behaviourist, look for somebody with CCAB after their name, because that's the highest level professional qualification. Okay, for the vet, if they're vets, it's slightly different. But that, I've got CCAB as well as my veterinary qualifications, and I think that's the way to go. So there seem to be a number of bars that sort of, we've now got this slight hierarchy in that situation.
We should say for those listening that there are those out there that wouldn't agree with us.
Oh, absolutely.
But ABTC,
this is our chat. This is our chat, not theirs. I'll chat to other people at other times.
So this is our opinion in the same way as Heineken is probably the best lager in the world. Or is it Carlsberg? I can't remember.
Heineken refreshes the parts other beers can't reach. Carlsberg is probably the best, and I say that because I have a Danish wife. And but apparently the yeast, I don't know if you know this, that the Carlsberg yeast, which is what made them famous, they actually stole from was it the French or something? I think it's really bizarre. Although they developed it, and it's the yeast.
The country not really famous for its lagers either.
Yeah,
if it's the French.
Yeah, I'm not sure where it came from. Unless maybe they stole it from the Czechs, perhaps. Maybe that would make more sense. I don't know. But anyway, so just out of interest, and given, as I said, your vast experience, what do you think? What do you find? I'm just intrigued with behaviour cases. What do you find the most challenging aspects of dealing with behaviour cases? The bits that you think, they're things we need to know more about, for you personally, and then you think perhaps we can talk generally about what we think people need training about.
Getting to the getting more and more information that guides us in our diagnostics. I'm working through our differentials. The more knowledge we accumulate there, the better it's going to be for doing the job, and also for the owners getting the service they need, on the animals they need.
Well, I think meeting the owners' expectations is a real challenge, and having to reframe their expectations as well. The timescales that these things take, I think, is a big issue.
Although I think your question was, what did I find most challenging? But if we get advances in there, then that reduces the challenge of getting to the correct diagnosis. And also working at which parts of a behavior modification program are relevant, and those that we're doing because we've always done them. But we've gone a long way with that. I think we are making great strides. Certainly more help, more knowledge with bitch fighting in the household would be great, because that's the hardest behavior problem in my experience.
Yeah, there's something that the prognosis is so much worse for inter-bitch aggression. And okay, you can understand it from a biological perspective if they're, sort of perhaps the origins of it. But I was sort of reassuring that you're struggling with those as well, because, as I said, our general rule is it's often quite a poor
They're
prognosis.
the most challenging, particularly in a smaller domestic environment at certain times of the year. Yes, they quite like bitches.
Yeah. But, I'm sort of also reassured by that, because you said about the diagnostics and then you said the specifications of treatments, because that's sort of what I've tried to focus on in my research career, so, from the practical point of view. We're trying now to be able to map more treatments on. And as I said, it's an area that I'm interested in with the separation-related problems, which I know is obviously an area that you've had sort of quite an extensive interest in, but trying to work out what is actually necessary. And one of the things that always struck me was quite early on in my academic career, I was given some money by SEVA I was asked by the guy in charge, what did I think were the biggest issues in behaviour? And I said the terminology that we use. We use the same words in different ways, different places. And they gave me quite a large amount of money to employ somebody to go and interview vets around the world working in the field of behaviour and work out how we were using terms. So things like cognitive dysfunction and involutive depression, the French term, when we asked them about the signs, they were talking about the same thing but using different words. Dominance was another term, separation anxiety was another. Trying to get sort of beyond that stage, that trying to bring things together. And you really sort of brought to the fore stuff that was in the French literature about hyperattachment, and primary and secondary, and I think that
also tried to do a lexicon for the ESVCE with Tini DeCusta.
Okay.
She and I were working on a lexicon and trying to get people to contribute, but that never really took off. And then I think Karen Overall took it over for a while as a project. I think so.
I mean, Karen Overall had this sort of the necessary and the sufficient criteria, but that was she's so sort of, I think, wedded to the medical model, and that's why academically we don't agree on much. I think from the perspective of what a problem behaviour is. For her, the focus is all on the neurology. My attitude to the neurology is, just because you see a receptor, that doesn't mean that receptor, the drug works on that receptor, but there's, the drugs work on so many other things. And there's that danger that you oversimplify it. And the more I read about the neurology, etc., the more, as you say, you know what you don't know. And you start to become aware that most stuff about the neurology is such a gross simplification as well. And I think it's sort of, there's a danger that it dresses things up to make it sound much more scientific, as opposed to just saying, we don't really know how these drugs work. We know they work on these receptors, but we don't know if that's actually relevant. And the example I always give to the students is, it's sort of probably about 15 years ago, maybe more, that work that was done on rats that found that fluoxetine switches on genes, and it switches on genes in the prefrontal cortex, which are involved in inhibitory control of behaviour. Now, actually, so of course fluoxetine works on serotonin, and serotonin we know is important in all sorts of things. But maybe actually just switching on the genes is a primary effect, and especially when you think about it having such a delayed effect in people.
Mm.
And, all this stuff about, it's working on this synapse and that synapse, and you just think, maybe not. We got to consider maybe not. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't learn about the neurology, but there is a danger, I think, of dressing it up. And as I said, the animal is part of a system with the owner. And personally, one of the things, I wish I had more training in human behaviour change. It's something which I think, and that's something I think the Southampton course did very well, because you'd got Anne there as a psychologist. But that human behaviour change side, and it's become quite important, I think, in the veterinary profession as well. People are becoming much more aware of that.
Well, the clinical animal behaviour is indispensable, because we need to know their perspective of the situation as individuals. And one thing I've certainly learnt in history taking is ignore the children at your peril.
Yeah.
Because they observe so much.
Yeah.
And they just relate it as they've seen it whereas the parents just haven't really noticed it. It's amazing. And then, of course, they're the ones that are going to have to implement the behaviour modification program that we've mutually agreed with them is going to be applied. So the human psychology side is so important, and anyone wanting to do this job, because they love animals, forget it.
Yeah, I absolutely.
Got to like people.
Got to like people, absolutely.
We can help the people through what we know about animals. Of course, we love the animals as well, and we're interested in the animals, and we're desperate to ensure that the animals get the best welfare they can. but to do the job, you've really got to like people.
Yeah. And I actually gave a lecture to the students a couple of weeks ago, and it was a new lecture. It was more of a discussion, and we were talking about the emotional load of having an animal with problem behaviour, because we've more broadly in pet ownership, it's something we've started to look at. And after the session, I just saw one of the students sort of, because they're encouraged to sort of write. They don't tweet it, but they write like a tweet, just to say what they've taken from it. And they said something like, when I saw what the session was going to be on, I sighed and thought, oh, it's going to be the human side. But actually, it's been one of the best sessions that we've had, because it's really woken me up to, the need to focus on the client as well as the animal. And you think, okay, well, that's good. We've managed to help with that, that side of things, just to raise that awareness. And it is so important. But I'm gonna steal that phrase. Ignore the children at your peril. I think that's a really that's a really good tip, as you say, because they do. There's no facade about them at all. And whereas some clients, they're embarrassed, and it's understandable. They want to hold back stuff, but
and the stuff they've seen, stuff they've seen and observed, which the parents have completely missed.
Well, they're probably busy doing all the other things around the home, whereas the kids are actually spending the time with the animals. No, Mum, you do that. So that's one of the things that I sometimes do with clients. And increasingly, certainly the cases that I see, and as I said, maybe it's because, we're training a lot of people locally, but the cases that we tend to get in our clinic, the vast majority of them have a medical aspect which needs working up. So most of my clinical work now is after the I do the consultation, but we're then trying to get the animal worked up more medically. So we spend much more time on preparing owners for that behaviour modification exercise. And I find that really satisfying, getting people skilled up, rather than just saying, go and do this. And you realise, they can't even get the dog to sit, so how the heck are they supposed to do a desensitization program? Let's get them skilled and teaching them observation skills, teaching them to keep decent records. And one of the things that I do sometimes is sort of, inadvertent reinforcement. So what I want you to do is, I want you to watch each other, and each time you see one of them do it, you note it down on a piece of paper, and you put the parents against the kids. And you say, right, if at the end of the week the kids have made more observations than you have, then the kids get... Unfortunately, people don't get pocket money now, so you have to give them something else, yeah? But you set it up as a competition. And it's brilliant because, A, it teaches people to watch because they've got something to lose if they've got to pay their kids at the end of it. It becomes a game for the family. And as I said, I just think 9 times out of 10, the kids wipe the floor with their parents because it's a chance for them to get back at their parents in a non-aggressive way.
And they've got an incentive because they might get pocket money or
yeah. And and if they lose, then they have to clean their room or they have to clean the house or something like that. You just agree, that sort of thing. But it teaches them to observe and to then become much more aware of what they're doing as well, which is one of the really hard things for people, because there's so much that we just do intuitively, and they've got into these habits. And it's a great way of breaking out of it. But as I said, sometimes I haven't got children involved. I have to set the partners up against each other. But do tell them to be supportive of each other and not to make it too... but it's
too competitive.
Yeah. But as I said, the kids love it from that point of view. So we were talking about separation-related problems. And as I said, your work with Jolanda Ploegmachers, I think I've got it right. Very much highlighted that a role of the importance of hyper-attachment and the discussion that we've had about it. And I think that was really important for making people much more aware of the importance of security in the environment for dogs. And
the maintenance set.
Yeah.
Of animate and inanimate objects that create allow the dog has attached positive emotional states to. So
that phrase, the maintenance set, I think you were the first people that I heard use it in that context. Where did that come from? Was that just from your head, or I'm showing my ignorance now?
We were looking at attachment theory and what causes animals to have positive emotional states. We go back to Scott, for example. He found that puppies would very quickly form, if you like, emotional homeostasis within an environment within 20 minutes. And if they were removed from that environment within 20 minutes, they would become distressed. And then there's a whole criteria, not the right word, but there's a whole list of different things that they found would ameliorate distress. So a familiar conspecific would ameliorate distress more readily than an unfamiliar other dog conspecific. But not as much as a human being, and a familiar environment as opposed to an unfamiliar environment. And we have all these strategies. So there's that and other work that shows that the things that can allow a dog to maintain emotional homeostasis aren't just the human companion, but animate and inanimate objects. If the maintenance set is unbalanced and too much in the direction of the owner, either because the owner's been extremely available, so other things have become less important, or have never become important, or something has challenged the dog's emotional homeostasis, such as unpleasant experiences or a house move. So many of the maintenance stimuli that were inanimate have gone. So 16% of dogs moving to a new home, according to Sexel's Australian study, develop long-term separation problems. So I think that answers the question. That's where we got. That's where we got it from.
The term
maintenance set.
Yeah. Okay. It's said the term maintenance set though. Is that? I don't recall Scott referring to it as a maintenance set.
No. I think we might have termed the maintenance set. Okay. I think we might have done, but my memory might be failing me.
I'm not going to challenge you on it because, as I said, that you were the first person I heard use the term. So I'll support your amnesia. Maybe somebody will come and say, "Oh no, that was back in 1832."
Yeah, that's always possible. Daisy chain.
We were talking earlier, with Vicky Voigt and the stuff that she did with David Tuber on desensitization, and I still show the students this because there's been this growth in applied behavioural analysis, and David Tuber, he had the heart rates of those dogs as he was doing the desensitization, and when he published the stuff, it's often in obscure little books, chapters, but you've got the heart rate changes and whatever, and you just think, when did we become so lazy that we didn't use, if he was doing this in the 70s, why did we become so lazy and not, and use that as a monitor for doing it? It's sort of...
It's a shame that there isn't more distilling of all the information that we have into core texts than we have.
Yeah.
Just the information. Because there's been so much work done that is not easily accessible for many people unless you're in academia, because it's so expensive to access.
They did do that. The Americans did that Readings in Animal Behaviour, which was a collection of a lot of the early articles, the key articles, and that to me was, I picked up some of those articles when I was in the States, but that was a really useful compendium. Maybe we ought to do something like that. We ought to. This is a suggestion. I'm about to start editing the new edition of the BSAVA manual, but maybe afterwards, I'll chat to you about this. We should go to people in the field and ask them about a classic paper in the field, and then provide an update on it, a comment, readings. That'd be quite a cool thing to do, wouldn't it? That'd be quite.
And where it's got to. It's progression. How
So, and maybe it's how some of the ideas have been misinterpreted, etc. But equally, so sort of a historical commentary as well as a practical commentary. I think that'd be quite a cool thing to do. Anyway, we'll see. Maybe somebody will say, "Oh, I'm already doing that." Somebody else will do it. That's fine, as long as somebody does it. I think it'd be a neat thing to do at some point.
maybe someone listening to this will start it before you have time to finish.
Doesn't bother me as long as it gets done. It happens often enough. So the other thing is, as I said, you for your masters you did the work on the socialization as well, and that's the other.
In puppies, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm always intrigued as to sort of where ideas come from, and I guess there was a lot of talk about the importance of socialization. So if people aren't familiar with the work, you looked at the effects of animals coming from non-domestic households versus domestic households on the development of things like fear-related aggression. And it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. I don't think anybody else had anywhere near the sort of caseload to be able to do this other than yourself. I mean, first of all, that must have been a pain in the arse going through all those histories, because you didn't gather the data with a view to doing the research, I'm sure.
No, I didn't. It was a retrospective study on, and it was 820 cases, if I remember right, in the end, where we had the full history of maternal environments where the puppies were living before they moved to their first owners, the age of homing, the history post-homing. So it had to be the first owner whose client report was being studied to glean the information. The history of it, of why I did it. I've talked about my early interest in Fox, and he did a lot of critiques on Scott and Fuller's work. And then I had interfaced quite a lot with Derek Freeman, the breeding manager for Guide Dogs for the Blind. He actually, after he retired, he came and did some work for me within the practice. And anyway, for my masters, I thought if that early history was right, not the early history, if the early research was right, way back from the 1950s and 60s and 70s, then in a clinical population, we should see that if we have problems related to avoidance behavior and some types of aggression, we should see that the early history of those dogs was that they came from stimulus deprivated situations. So we were looking on the influence of the maternal environment, the age of homing, and experience post-vaccination, which was on average, vaccination was started 2 days after adoption, according to Serpil and Jago's work, Andrew Jago's thesis, which he was kind enough to give me. And we found, yes, the implications you would think, the things that you would imply from the early research were true.
And I think the neat thing about that is, I think it's easy to underestimate how big an effect that must be to shine through when you've got all the other things going on in the animals' lives, and that still came through as a significant factor. I've actually got a PhD student at the moment, and she's looking at the prediction of aggression, and your paper is one of the ones, and she's recalculating odds ratios on all of the papers that she can get the data, so we can actually quantify the change in the odds as a result. But as I said, you think of all the diversity, all the different ways that animals are brought up, etc., and still that shines through. And because people say, oh yeah, well, they did that in the isolation experiments. Yeah, well, the isolation experiments were very highly controlled, so you are going to see stuff coming through. And actually, what you get in an isolation experiment is completely different to the real world. It just tells you, an isolation experiment, as you know, tells you what might affect the behaviour. It doesn't tell you what's actually
and we
important.
think the interpretation of some of those isolation experiments was wrong anyway. They give a socialization period from 2.5 to 3 weeks to 12/14 weeks, but by the time we're getting the end of that scale, you're already in the too late stage.
So if you were giving advice to somebody, I just want intrigued because of and obviously it depends. If it's in an ideal world, when would you see puppies being rehomed by breeders? Assuming, and what would the breeder have to be doing to allow it to happen at that age? Just what would your take on that?
From the research side, we did further research here at Helsinki University, with a student doing their thesis, and then we published it as a paper. So it is out there. Applied animal behaviour. It's I'm struggling to remember his surname. His first name is Ollie. We found, because in Finland it was hypothesized that predominantly puppies were raised within a domestic environment. And rather than breeding kennels and that sort of thing being in the mix, as they were in my UK population. And it was something like 93% of puppies did come from a domestic environment. And whereas in the UK study, we can say that if they're living in a non-domestic maternal environment, they need to get out of there before 8 weeks.
Okay.
If it's from a domestic environment, then it's at 8 weeks, and the longer after 8 weeks, then the greater influence on unwanted behaviors in adulthood, because we're talking about unwanted behaviors in dogs that were a year plus. So my advice would be to get a puppy from a domestic environment at 8 weeks, where the breeder has been doing what they can to introduce stimulus variation, but also normalcy, so that puppies also learn that humans are incredibly boring and watch television and do the washing up, and are not always coming into the room to do something proactive, because that also, I think, can land up with frustration problems. Because of expectations being created.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I had a chat with the students the other week. Actually, we were talking about what does it mean for a dog to be socialised, and there seems to be a population of people who think that a socialised dog is a dog that's going to bound up to other dogs and play with them. And you're thinking, no, a socialised dog, notices them and largely ignores them. That's the whole point,
well, socialised dog might be the dog that lives in the pub. People go, come on then, and unless you've got a packet of crisps.
But it's interesting, isn't it? So are you up to any research at the moment? You got any students?
No, I'm retired now.
Well, you're still doing stuff in Helsinki. And I saw that your boat has arrived, so I guess you'll be doing nothing.
It's still sitting on the side, having been unloaded, and haven't climbed up on it yet. But that was just to check it didn't have too much snow on. On the fringes of some work that's being done, but not directly involved.
Okay. You can't say though.
No.
Okay. Okay, what stuff have you got that you haven't written up yet that you might do in your dotage, seeing as you've retired? Got anything you might be on the horizon?
Maybe a manual based on clinical experience combined with the research at this point in time. Maybe not. We'll see.
Oh well. But
but based on sort of case experience, clinical experience.
Well, so I might be editing a new initiative, which is looking to educate through case studies. So I might be knocking on your door asking if you want to write some case studies. Then what are the lessons that can be taken from, and it's a new initiative by Cabby, the publisher. And I don't know whether I should be saying this. There wasn't any confidentiality agreement, so I can talk about it. They've already done something in relation to tourism. And the idea is to, I think one of the frustrating things sometimes with case studies is they get written and then they get forgotten. And, whilst people might say, well, case studies are low-level evidence, they're actually, advertisers know that nothing sells like a case study, So they can be really good from the point of view of illustrating certain points. And so Cabby have decided to sort of launch this, I wouldn't call it a journal or whatever, but this idea, and I haven't agreed that I will lead on it, but they asked me if I would. I probably will. But the idea is, to use case studies much more, and then sort of, well, this is what we can take from, these are the lessons that we can do, and for people to use them in education as well. So I might,
hopefully they can have the caveats that this isn't a model for everything that's presented.
No, absolutely. They're the sorts, because when I was chatting with them, these are the sorts of things I said, you got to be careful with it, how they're used, and they seem to have got a good system in place for how they want it to operate, I think that would be quite a neat thing, as I said, and probably be a year or more before anything gets launched, but as I said, to have a series and then to add more cases, and I think it brings better value. So particularly the variability that we have with cases, it's very difficult to get a homogeneous population. Unless you've got 900 cases of puppies to look at in your caseload that you're going to go through, looking at those sorts of things. But to illustrate the point and as much teach people, these are things you need to be considering, not this is what you're going to, like the qualitative work that I do. It's not that, these are things for you to now think about as a clinician. I'm not saying these are diagnostic. It goes back to this idea, of how we define the problems and making people aware that, and I think you're spot on. You don't want people to just say, oh, well, I read about that case and it's got that little bit and therefore my case has got it. People rush into confirmation bias the whole time. And to just say, no, think about it, be aware of it, make the judgment as to whether or not you think it's relevant to your case. And I think there's an enormous amount we can still do in that perspective, from the point of view, people need to understand some of the core principles, but it's that, I guess it's teaching professional judgment, isn't it? It's a way of teaching professional judgment, that those nuanced things that you pick up on and trying to articulate it.
The nuances have got to be there, and the variables that have to be, or some of the variables at least would have to be highlighted.
So think about this as opposed to follow this, this formulaic way of, because otherwise, a computer could do the job. I don't think a computer can do the job or should be doing the job, whether it be behaviour or whether it be a medical issue as well. But anyway, right. So I think that there were things I really wanted to chat to you about. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed catching up. As I said, I've learned more about your past. It's been lovely to see you and catch you before your retirement.
Well, I'm sort of retired. I'm still doing involved with the course at Odyssey. With marking and lecturing. But otherwise, apart from some other lecturing work, sort of retired.
And I always say Finland has, the best quality of life in the world. So you're enjoying it in Finland. Although the winter's... I did go to Helsinki in the winter, and the thing that struck me was the street lighting is so completely different, isn't it? during the day, that when it's pitch black, it does have a very different feel to it. But anyway, but
it's very beautiful outside at the moment, and
I can imagine.
Albeit -20 today.
Ooh, jeez. So you take care. Thank you so much, David. It's been lovely to catch up with you, and
you.
All the best. Thanks a lot. Bye now.
Bye. Bye.
After recording this chat with David, he got in touch to say he wished he'd given a bit more recognition to Sarah Heath and her role as the first veterinary member of the APBC, and a subsequent role in promoting behaviour within the veterinary profession, at first as the APBC's veterinary representative, and subsequently her involvement in the development of the CCAB scheme. So I agreed that I'd add this little footnote at this point just to give that recognition to Sarah. If you want to hear more about Sarah's background and Sarah's thoughts on clinical animal behaviour, I did do a podcast with her a little while ago, and you can find it as number 12 in this series of What Makes You Click. Thanks for listening. Take care.